Hey everybody, this is Professor Lilly, and I wanted to give my own example of a monster from a popular culture text, and in part because I've been reading some of your posts, and a lot of them are doing a really good job kind of reading into the narrative of the text that you chose, and kind of reading or thinking about what the monster means within the context of that story, of that narrative, and that's fine. I mean, that's one of the things you do with doing kind of a what we could call a monster theory reading. But I wanted to focus more on what some of you are kind of missing out on a little bit is the idea of thinking within these seven theses, thinking about what the monster kind of represents, um, both in our kind of current time, but also in the time when the author or that text was being created. So if it was a book, then when the author was writing it, or when it was a television series, when it was being produced, and when the writers were writing the screenplays, and when the directors and actors were actually producing the film or the TV series. And so to do that, I chose the dragons from Game of Thrones, partially because I've read the books and watched the series, and so I'm familiar with it. And then also because I figure that most of you should be at least familiar with some of the story aspects, even if you haven't watched or finished the series or certainly read the books. So let me start with thesis number one. The monsters body is a cultural body, and I'm going to put this. I'm just making this as a simple Word doc, and I'll save it as a PDF and I'll put it up. And again, part of the reason is because the monster theory could be a strategy for you to use when you're doing your final project. It's certainly kind of open as one of the tools, depending on what text you choose for your final project analysis. So if you know some of the if the strategy that I'm kind of using was a little bit different than what you did in your post for this week, don't stress out about it. You're not being you're being graded on the fact that you were trying to understand this, because it's not a simple kind of concept, monster theory, and by this point you're only basing it on your reading of the article and then also the YouTube lecture series. So if my video here gives you different ideas on how you would approach the doing a monster reading in the future, or the next time you do it, then then don't stress out, feel like you did it wrong, because a lot of you were doing a good job, but you're just focusing more on the text, not thinking about what aspects of the text, or of the story of the monsters in the story represent in our culture today. So again, so the monster's body is a cultural body. So I put a little strategy here for you. So what I'm doing when I'm thinking about this thesis is that want to look at the historical and cultural context of the time of the creation of the text. So and there's two kind of times here we're talking about, because George R. R. Martin started working on this book series in the 1980s, and then obviously in the 2000s, or when the television series is being created, right? So we kind of have to think about two times, and they're close enough together, that and particularly just in terms of, I think, the way that the text is being written itself, I don't think that there's anything that's so particular to the 1980s, or the 2000s or 2020s that would say that it could be one or the other specifically, because they're both close enough together. So again, think about the historical and cultural context of the time of the creation of the text, and the how the monster's body and the monster itself, in terms of what it's doing and what it is in the text, how that's an allegory for issues, concepts, and events in those historical contexts. Again, from our history, from the Earth as we know it in its history. So with Shelley's Frankenstein, you would be talking about, she was writing it in the 1890s, and then but most of the subsequent popular culture texts after her book are done in the 20th century. Um, so that's a fairly that's a bigger distance. So that if you're doing that reading, you might have to think about both those, but probably more so from the book. Although the monster's body does change and is different in a lot of the films, which again are distanced by several decades from the book. Um, Okay, so for me, what I'm going to say is that the dragons, again, thinking about what they represent in our culture, the culture of George R. R. Martin and the directors of the TV series, represent technology, kind of similar in a way that if you had chosen Godzilla, that clearly Godzilla represents a kind of fear in the devastation and destruction of the nuclear blasts in Japan that ended World War II, and that awesome, amazing destruction. But it's also a destruction that we, as humans, kind of own because we are part of that, and it also represents that the military culture of Japan that led to its involvement in its aggression in World War II, representing that that's a part of why the industry or that destructive power of the atomic bomb ended up coming after them. So I think about it as the dragons, and again, it's partially due to my reading of the narrative in Game of Thrones itself, right? So we have Daenerys Targaryen and her brother, who have basically, they're in exile and they have no strength, they have no army, they're being told they have supporters back in Westeros, but they don't even know to what extent. So basically all they have is their name as Targaryens. Now that's a powerful name from history in Game of Thrones because the Targaryens, took over Westeros with the might of the dragons and completely overthrew the kings and rulers that were in Westeros before that time, right? So the Targaryens' fame and their strength was always about dragons, right, as a military force. And so she is able to, Daenerys is able to capture that strength and power because she's able to get hold of this basically a technology, and it's technology in several different ways of might. It's and I've chose this image here. So this is where they're battling the fleet, and the fleet has come up. I think it's a fleet largely of from the Grey Islands. But at this point, they are in an alliance with Cersei and the Lannisters, and they've developed a new technology of the spears shot at, or basically cannons with spears to try to take down the dragons. And I think in this scene, they actually are able to kill one of the dragons with their new technology. So it also represents, so George R. R. Martin is, I think he's in his 70s at this point. So he's of that kind of generation that was highly affected personally, but also the history of his time would have all been about the world wars, which are all about, military might. And if you take in, Western history and the 20th century, a lot of it is about, escalation of new technologies trying to compete with this nation or that nation, and having one-upsmanship that really mattered because those technologies allowed you to have an advantage and allow you to win battles and eventually to win wars. And certainly the technological advancement of the atomic bomb, it ended the war. And if it wasn't for the German military and the government already failing in Europe, then they might have used that technology there, the atomic bomb as well. So certainly the dragons can represent other things, flying technologies, certain things. But I definitely think that a strong argument to make, for this thesis is that their bodies, the dragons, certainly in the actual narrative of Game of Thrones, they are an amazing military might, a military technology. And so if we're thinking about what they represent in our culture and the culture of the writers and directors, it's easy to make that argument as well. Okay, so for the second thesis, the monster always escapes. So, like with all these theses, you definitely do want to look at the narrative and think about what the narrative and what the story, how it's using the monster. And, in this one, it's a little bit difficult because, a lot of monster movies, the monster does escape. But even if the monster is killed, there's always a possibility that it will come back, right? And so, how does this shape the end of the narrative when you're thinking about the narrative or the story aspect? And what does it represent in our culture today? So, for me, for the Game of Thrones, um, in the story itself, I think the cat is out of the box, right? Like I have here, there's still one dragon left at the end. They shaped the power landscape in Westeros yet again, just like the Targaryens did originally a few hundred years before. Um, and perhaps there are Targaryens to raise more dragons. For us, this represents, in our culture. And again, you always want to say, okay, what's going on in the narrative, and then what does this represent in our culture or the culture of when the text is being created. And it represents that once you create or invent a technology and you use it, then you can never go back, right? So it's always going to be part of our landscape of the history of planet Earth and the history of humanity. And and then you can think specifically about what does it mean. So like with militaristic technology, it means there's always a one-upsmanship, and then for us on Earth we have the Cold War, where the big nations are representing. If we keep on doing this, then the likelihood of us destroying the whole planet with nuclear bombs becomes more and more likely, because there's more and more nuclear bombs and more fingers on the triggers, and even just a slip up, an accident, or a misunderstanding could mean the destruction of the human race and of life on Earth. That's a very real conversation that was happening in the 1970s and 80s with the Cold War and trying to pull back the number of nuclear weapons, right? So how about with number three? So the monster is the harbinger of category crisis. So for this one, my strategy is to think about, recognize that monsters represent cultural change and dual like change of categories within culture, because in culture we're always trying to categorize things and say this is this and this is that. Music, hip hop, it was or early rock and roll are good examples because they were mergers, they're hybrids of several different strains of music and being applied in different ways. So basically creating a new category. So again, I always start with a narrative and then go into our culture and history. So this one I have two things. So and that's the reason why I have the photo here of Daenerys and Drogon. And so in Game of Thrones, female leaders are a cultural crisis in that particular world and that story, right? So, I mean, the idea that a woman could lead is a big idea. Is a bigger idea. Well, the books aren't done yet, but in the movies, with I'm trying to think of the name of Stark, not Arya, Sansa Stark, right? And even within in herself, like, I mean, you could tell that she has the makings of being a great leader, but she even had doubts within herself as if she could challenge Jon, and when he even recognizes that she would be a better leader for the Starks than he was. And finally, and obviously the in the North, it represents a very patriarchal type society, and they couldn't even think about that a woman would be the leader or the king in the North, or at least the lord of all the lords there and all the kind of fiefdoms. So, and then obviously we have Daenerys that they always joke as being a girl and things like that. And so this would also be certainly true if we take that to the time of George R. R. Martin and all the ridicule that female leaders all over the world had, and certainly at the time in the 1980s and 1990s, not being really many head leaders of nations that were women in the world, and even still today, right? People are saying, can is the United States ready for a female vice president, and things like that. So, and then the other one we would have here, technology is the double-edged sword for helping and hurting, right? So again, a categorical crisis because we recognize that technology can be used to create lots of technologies for killing people and hurting people, but at the same time, technology is used in science to help people. Like you think about the COVID vaccine, right now, and trying to get the world out of this pandemic. But at the same time, people, even with those helpful technologies, people have a lot of distrust and fear because they're kind of new categories, right? Sometimes perhaps the fear of those helpful technologies are well founded, and perhaps other times, not so much. Okay, so Theses 4, the monster dwells at the gate of difference. So a good strategy for this is to think about how the monster might represent gender, racial, and sexual difference. And you might have touched on those and what it could have represented for the other theses, but this is a really good one to really hone in on those. So what I was thinking about is in the Game of Thrones story, Daenerys assembles basically what her enemies call an army of freaks, right? She has the Dothraki savages, who are definitely considered like very othered. They're mentioned many times as being like this crazy other things that people in Westeros, don't understand. She has her army of eunuchs. She has ex-slaves, many of them ex-prostitutes. She has her dwarf hand. She has the dragons. And so all these things can represent, a coalition of difference. So for me, what I think this represents is the author, and then also the the directors of the television series, a desire for people to accept and celebrate, a more diverse and eclectic society. Like so, in the movie or in the television series, there's definitely an attempt to make all these different groups of people be very be real people. They're humans. They might each have different ways, but even the Dothraki savages, they really love Dany, and they have their own ways, and their ways kind of make sense within their own culture. And she's a hero to the ex-slaves that she freed, right? And to the eunuchs who she treats as people, not some kind of weird, othered type group. Okay, and then the monster polices the orders of the possible. So think about what the monster opens up as new possibilities in our culture, and how things change the same, or still the same. So with all the focus on female leadership in the books and the series, women can be great leaders. They can be very strong leaders. Diversity can be a strength, and is kind, is equitable, but still people strive for power and dominance, and will do anything to achieve it, and we see that in the politics and national strife of today all over the world. For number 6, the fear of the monster is really a kind of desire. So think about what the monsters can do in your story, like in the stories that you're analyzing, and what they enable, and then what this might represent in the time or today, right? So, like technology allowing people like coming up with an app and being able to make millions of dollars, or figuring out a trick on Wall Street and making millions of dollars. Like technology, like her finding that egg is what makes her be able to. Granted, puts her in a position to be a great leader, but at the same time, it can be a metaphor for today is what you can kind of find in technology or even education, lots of different things to give you the key to go on and to do that great thing. Certainly, in the Game of Thrones, the monsters allow her, or the dragons allow her to fly, to be powerful. And so, what does this represent today in terms of a desire for power and other things that technology allow you or enabled someone to possibly do? And with that, before I get to the last one, I just want to recognize. So in this analysis that I'm doing right now, I'm choosing to focus on the dragons in Game of Thrones. So it might be, I could extend this analysis and choose some other books or television series with dragons in them. And usually dragons, do represent, you know, the power that the person or human who can kind of control the dragons might have, but it might open up other possibilities too. So I could, if I want to extend my analysis, I could say, well, I'm going to look at dragons in these three different texts. So it makes it a little bit easier because I'm looking. Granted that this group of texts has books and a very long television series that lots has been written about, but it does make my analysis a teeny bit easier, just because the author, I think in his mind also had certain things that he was thinking in terms of what dragons might represent, and certainly what they make possible within the story, within the narrative of Game of Thrones. And then finally, number 8, the monster stands at the threshold of becoming. So for me, I feel like this kind of summarizes all of them. What now, with what the monsters enabled to happen in the story, how did that change the story because of the monster? So that world in the story is changed forever, right? And think about, how was it changed forever in the Game of Thrones world? The cat is out of the bag. It's changed the landscape of what's going on in Westeros and in that planet forever. And then how in our society, how is our world changing because of these changes that the dragons represent? So here I could talk about the fact that we have more female leaders, the fact that partially maybe because of democracy. There's democracy more all over the world. And then I probably, if I was getting into this analysis, would focus a little bit more on the technology and what it could represent and how we can never go back. So thinking about, I could get into talk about artificial intelligence. I could start talking about the internet and the revolution in media that we've had through social media and the web that was very different than when I was a little kid in the 1980s. Thinking about those cultural changes. And then certainly I could have a couple paragraphs talking about the more military aspect of the changes that happened because of the opening up of technology for military in World War II. So that's my analysis, and just just to kind of get you to think about what's going on in the text itself, and then what it represents at the time of the writing of the text, and then also what it could represent today. So hopefully you're watching this before you've done all of your commenting on other people, so you can kind of throw in some of your thoughts based on. So I wanted to say one last thing. Monster culture, as we get into the course, or monster theory, it's just going to be a tool for you to really to help you to think about and analyze and break down a particular popular culture text, and in your final project, you might kind of do your own monster theory analysis and discuss it, and use it as a way to kind of bring out lots of ideas that you have about the text, and
There's so many
and
layers.
then as a springboard into the next layer of analysis. So, for example, in my monster theory analysis, the one I did of Game of Thrones, I didn't really even get into the fact that the writer George R. R. Martin used a lot of history in the UK, specifically the War of the Roses, um, as kind of a building blocks and also for ways of him to kind of retell the story and some of the more interesting aspects of the story of that era of feudal lords fighting for power in Britain. And so certainly, I'm not trying to say that you shouldn't look so much at what could this particular text represent today, and not look at the narrative itself, and not look at what the writers and creators of that narrative of that text were really thinking about. So there's a whole lot, depending on the cultural text that you choose. There's a whole lot you can look into the specific author and what the story was trying to talk about. And that doesn't even get into, if I was going to do Game of Thrones for my own analysis on a big project, then I would also get into all of the fan culture, right? Because there's a gigantic pop culture fan culture for Game of Thrones. There's fans who are writing their own kind of chapters and taking different characters on different journeys. On YouTube, there's hundreds of different kind of meme videos, and some of them are celebrating certain characters. Like I could type in right now, Arya Stark, and let's just see what we get. And there's all sorts of fan videos, based on her, people that love her, the character, and the different transformations she goes through. And remember that this is a popular culture class, so we're not just kind of reading into this text and taking it on its own. We're talking about what is the impact in popular culture. Why is it so popular? What do people love about it? Because that also tells you about the text, and then it also tells you about our culture that we live in now, right? So a popular text from before the internet, the ways that people would celebrate it and talk about it and how it would become popular is way different nowadays than it was 40, 50 years ago, in terms of what popular culture kind of was at that time and what it is today. So there's all sorts of other levels of the analysis, but monster theory and the seven theses are just one way that for some texts that have those type of characters in it, that can help you to understand and get into and think about what it represents vis-a-vis what happens in the actual narrative itself.